What about the pressure in terms of the development of the infrastructure for the planners who have to lay out water lines, and where does the money come to do that?
This is a difficult area. Of course, in the Highlands of Scotland, the local authorities are fairly small and they're fairly poor, and they don't have, traditionally, they haven't had many professional staff. And a large-scale development that oil brings obviously demands a lot of extra work put on very few people. Very often the technical officials of these local authorities don't have the specialist knowledge that they need to have to help them in their designing of these projects. And inevitably it means that a lot of the infrastructure lags behind. The sheer problem of designing houses, the problems of getting schools underway, these can't always be provided even later on in the life of an oil project.
What about the tax base? And do these companies bring in the money that makes it or provide to the communities the necessary tax base so that they can do this expansion?
Well, the system in Scotland is that local authorities levy a local property tax known as the rates, and they're supplemented quite heavily in rural areas by government grants. Now, the government does make a special additional element in their support based on oil impact, and this money has certainly assisted with the provision of housing and schools and other essential facilities. This oil-related element is calculated annually and is apportioned to local authorities in proportion to the amount of additional work they've undertaken. However, local authorities do provide a lot of extra facilities: roads, schools, clearance of rubbish, housing, and it's often very difficult to know whether the local authorities ever really get their money back on these sort of outlays. True enough, the site, the industrial development, is rateable and they get a certain amount of money back, sometimes a lot of money, from these sites. But whether it ever truly pays for everything they lay out in terms of additional facilities is something which is in the realms of obscurity, and I don't think many local authority treasurers have truly done their sums on this matter.
Okay, we're looking at an area now where this kind of development may come in the next year, the next 5 or 6 years, who knows. What should we think about?
I think the main thing is to be prepared. The oil industry hit the Highlands of Scotland rather quickly and unexpectedly. I think the most important thing is to understand the oil industry in advance. Try and get some facts and figures about the way the industry operates. Try and get some idea of what the impact's been in other places. This was certainly a lack in the Highlands when the oil industry first came here. Nobody really appreciated just what the scale of the industry was and what its demands would be. Another factor which I think should be looked into is what one's overall planning goals are. There's been a lot of argument in the Highlands as to whether the oil production platform should have been constructed in the Highlands, because it's meant the importation of a large labour force, a temporary labour force. It's meant the building of new facilities, new roads, new homes, new schools, in perhaps areas which in the long term don't need these facilities. And after all, the oil industry is essentially a short-term industry. It comes into an area, it moves on. if you're going to build new facilities, when the oil industry goes away, what's going to follow on? And certainly in Scotland, there's been a lot of people who have maintained that the development of the industry should have been concentrated in the Clyde estuary, where there are, after all, the population, the underused, underutilized shipyards, there are the skills, the trades, and the infrastructure, all waiting to be used. Whereas all these things have had to be imported into the Highlands for a fairly short term, and what the long-term future is for the region is fairly unknown. Now, this is obviously a political argument. Obviously, the developments within the Highland region have brought a lot of benefits. They've given a lot of people high incomes. They've done a lot for small business people. It's expanded a lot of businesses. It's improved the basic infrastructure of the region with new roads and new transport facilities, new housing. And who knows, this may well be to the advantage of the next generation of industry, whatever it is. But the question has to be asked, if the oil industry is basically a short-term phenomenon, where can you locate it to make the best long-term advantage?
The Norwegians seem to have tried to deal with that, and I'm wondering, have they done it more effectively, do you think?
Well, I can't speak with any experience of Norway, but certainly there have been a lot of jealous eyes cast to Norway. A lot of people maintain that Norway did the job better than in Scotland. But again, within Scotland, a lot of jealous eyes are cast to Shetland, where they seem to have got a really good deal out of the oil industry. It's very difficult to say that one place has done it better than another place.
Is it perhaps easier to consider different aspects of the industry that are perhaps more suited? Are there sort of cleaner sides and messier sides in terms of what it does to an area?
Well, clearly there's the development phase, when there's a lot of demand for oil construction platforms which are going to sit out on the wellhead doing the pumping out of the oil. Now, there's a limit to the number of these platforms that are needed, and obviously any yards that build that sort of facility are going to have a relatively short life. Now, to some extent that's the clean side of the industry, because the steel construction, concrete construction is relatively clean. It leaves obviously the site behind it, a hole in the ground, and the facilities that went with it. Now, at the other end of the oil business, you've got the shore landing of oil, you've got some sort of processing, refining. Now, that perhaps is the dirty end of the industry, and there's some attraction in processing the oil where it comes ashore. Now, that is the dirty end, but at the same time it involves relatively few people. An oil landing terminal with a certain amount of processing, not full refining, but perhaps storage and re-export by tanker or by pipeline, employs 400 people for a fairly long time span. Perhaps that's a scale which is appropriate to a rural area, and perhaps a rural area is prepared to put up with a certain amount of pollution to have that sort of relatively long-term job opportunities, and something that's in scale with their local communities. Whereas perhaps a yard that's constructing platforms, employing thousands of people for a very short time, is something, although it's clean, that a rural area would rather not have.
There's also the service base side of it, like Aberdeen area, the Grampian region seems quite happy to have that. They think it has a longer life than the construction side. So.
Well, a service base is very attractive, and there are a lot of communities in the Highland region that are fighting hard to have a service base. It has a lot of attractions. It employs a relatively small number of people. It uses a harbour very well. It draws on a wide range of local businesses and suppliers, and it's a very good sort of business for a small place to have. It has a lot of attractions, but there's obviously a limited number of firms who are going to be operating in this field, and they're going to concentrate all their business on as few number of ports as possible. So obviously that sort of benefit can't be spread widely. And again, it has its conflicts, particularly where you've got a thriving fishing fleet. And there have been many instances up the east coast of Scotland where the fishing industry and the service bases have not made good neighbours.
It's interesting you keep talking about kind of a desirable thing being the small numbers of working places, small number of jobs. We're facing with very high unemployment, and it strikes me that the opportunity of increased and large employment is the kind of apple that's going to be held out to us.
Well, it's the apple that's held out to everybody. It's the one commodity the oil industry can really win hearts and influence people with, in as much as it's offering jobs. And obviously there's going to be a strong local political lobby in favour of anything that's going to bring jobs to the district. But I think you've always got to ask yourself the question, how many local men are going to get jobs here? Because after all, a lot of the jobs which are being offered by the oil industry are fairly technical. They're demanding a fair degree of technical expertise, of experience from various trades. And how many jobs of that variety can be found amongst local people?
Can they be trained?
Yes.
Is there a training program going on that's effective?
Some of the bigger firms do offer training programs. The yard at Nig, for instance, has offered a very comprehensive training in welding so that local men can take jobs on the oil production platform construction business. But
that's one thing we have a lot of, welders being graduated, you know, this kind of thing. And they're going out into the western provinces.
yes. I think a local community, before they welcome any industry in, has got to ask very detailed questions about the sort of jobs that are going to be offered, and then they've got to ask themselves very honestly how many of their local men are really going to get jobs on this project. Now, the unemployment is obviously always a great factor which is going to sway people in favour of oil development. But I think it's always important to ask the question, what sort of jobs and how long will they last? Because a community may not get a good deal out of what's offered if the jobs are fairly short term and if they're not involving skills that are available locally. Because inevitably incomers are going to come in and take the jobs instead of local people.